afternoon, and welcome to our virtual gathering presented by the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance. We are the statewide membership-based historic preservation organization. My name is Beverly Thomas, and on behalf of the Preservation Alliance, I'm pleased to welcome you to House Histories, How to Research the Evolution of Your House with Andrew Cushing and May Williams. Today's program is part of our Old House and Barn Expo on the Road series, launched in March as our COVID-safe replacement of our postponed 2020 Expo. We'll continue to offer these virtual sessions throughout the year, and we'll soon be announcing some in-person events later in the summer and fall as well. We always enjoy getting you and other Old House and Barn owners together to share practical information from highly qualified presenters, make connections, and offer you a dose of energy and inspiration too. I know many of you have joined past Expo sessions, but for those who have not, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping points before we get started. I ask that you please stay muted to keep the background noise to a minimum. You may want to spotlight the speaker by choosing the side-by-side speaker option under the view feature, and also turn your video off to keep the internet connection as strong as possible. Today's presentation will run about 45 minutes and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. I'll wrap up the program by 1, but Andrew and May have agreed to stay on for an additional 15 minutes. So if you'd like to continue the discussion, feel free to stay on. During the presentation, we ask that you, if you have questions, use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to address your questions at the end. And before we close, we'll select a lucky winner of today's door prize. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speakers. Andrew Cushing currently serves as the Director of Bureau of Historic Sites for New Hampshire State Parks, but many of you may know him from his previous 3-year post as Field Service Representative for the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance. After receiving his Master's of Historic Preservation from the University of Pennsylvania, Andrew moved back to his hometown of Grafton, where he, in his own words, is the foolish owner of 2 old houses and is founder and president of Mascoma Valley Preservation. He and May have partnered in numerous preservation presentations and are leaders in New Hampshire's next generation of preservation champions. May Williams is preservation consultant at Unlocking History. May has a Master's of Arts in Historic Preservation from Plymouth State University and Bachelor of Arts in Medieval Art History. After receiving her secondary degree, she found a way of combining her love of history, architecture, and environmental conservation and a career in historic preservation. In 2014, May opened her own business as an independent historic preservation consultant and architectural historian and works out of an office in Center Harbor. She travels all across New Hampshire, studying individual properties, villages, and towns to develop property area histories, assist with local planning initiatives, and partners with others to help develop rehabilitation plans. So at this point, I'm pleased to turn it over to May and Andrew.
All right, well, thank you so much for having us here today. So what Andrew and I thought we would do is kind of talk about different strategies for researching the evolution of your house, and then go into a couple case studies to show how we've applied that on a couple specific projects. One thing I think that's really important to stress beginning with this is that every building is going to have a different amount of information available. So be realistic in your goals when you're starting out in terms of, you know, what you expect to find, and also try to write down where you found information and cite the sources, because as you're doing research, you might find something that counters that. Or that, you know, just have a little bit of confusion. So the more you write things down, the better as you go through. And figure out how to actually advance my slides. That would be good. So when you're working with historic buildings, there are a lot of different kinds of places where you can start. There's a lot of information available locally at local libraries, historical societies, and town offices. There's also a lot of information available down in Concord through the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, New Hampshire State Library, New Hampshire State Historical Society, New Hampshire Division of Records Management and Archives. And actually, specifically over the last few years, but a lot of information is available online. And we'll kind of get into the types of information available at each of these places. And I should also note that at the end of our presentation, Beverly will be sending around a little handout with a lot of this written down. So Andrew and I have, over the years, collected a lot of books, as you can see, as we're doing all of this. And these are some of the books that we both have on our desks that we keep referring back to all the time. Just basic books on how to go about finding fact finding for buildings, the evolution of style, and different kinds of buildings. A lot of times when I'm starting a research project, I start on the local level and find out what the town has. If you're lucky, your town has all the property cards and all that information available online through a GIS website. Oftentimes you do have to go to town hall to get the information. Town records usually only have really basic information, and it's important to also note that a lot of the information that they have may not be exactly accurate.
Not compiled by architectural historians.
Yeah, I was going to say it's usually done by, you know, somebody who's doing assessing, who isn't necessarily an architectural historian and hasn't necessarily done the research. So you can get approximate dates of construction or styles, but kind of take them with a grain of salt. But they're a good place to start, and then kind of narrow it down. Also, local records often have the last few property transfer records, so it will help you when you go to do deed research. I really like historic maps, and I use a lot of historic maps as I'm starting out doing research. A lot of the older maps in New Hampshire are available on the Dartmouth Digital Library Collections website, and are scanned in very high resolution, which is really helpful. Sometimes even looking at maps from before when you think your property was constructed is really helpful to kind of figure out how your property that you're looking at fits into kind of the evolution of the area. So it's sometimes helpful to figure out where those early roads are, where the early meeting house was if it isn't there anymore, and those kinds of things. In the approximately 1860, these large wall-sized county maps were commissioned for all the counties in New Hampshire. And these maps are really, really useful and have a huge level of detail. In addition to showing all the town outlines and everything, they show all the major roads and most of the dwellings within the town, and the name of the person that was living there when the map was made. This isn't necessarily the owner, and so sometimes it's a tenant farmer or similar. The maps also have little blown up sections of major villages and industrial centers throughout the state. Most of the maps are available on the Library of Congress website in super high resolution. They're also available on some other websites and are all digitized at the New Hampshire State Library, as Andrew has just told me. And a lot of times too, they're hanging in your town hall or local historical society, so are available more closely. A very similar map, type of map was done in 1892 in the Hurd Town and City Atlas of the state of New Hampshire. This atlas has this very similar kind of information from 32 years later, approximately 32 years later, and is available online in a couple different places. The David Rumsey Map Collection has it, and I've used that a lot, but it's also available in other areas as well. And again, it's who was living in the building at the time, so not necessarily the owner, but a good place to start and get you a couple names as you're going through your research. Another really useful source of mapping information in New Hampshire are fire insurance maps, particularly those of the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company. These really detailed maps were drawn up of the larger communities in New Hampshire and a lot of the manufacturing centers. And they would do it, every so many years. So you get a couple different snapshots. What's really useful with them is they might not tell you the name of the person who lived in the house, but they will show some construction details, such as how many stories a building was, what it was constructed out of, show outlines of porches and outbuildings, and even sometimes show windows and things like that. So if you're trying to figure out that when a porch was added to your house, if you look at the Sanborn map from 1883 and it's not there, and it's not there in 1887, and it's not there in 90 something, but then is there in 1902, that gives you a window for when it was probably constructed. And from my experience, they're really accurate, which makes sense because they're basing your insurance evaluation off of them. There were bird's eye view maps commissioned of several New Hampshire communities, actually quite a few, in the mid 19th to late 19th century. And a lot of these are available on the Library of Congress website, as well as other sites. These maps aren't quite as accurate as the Sanborn maps, but can be really useful and can have a huge amount of detail. And I think this is your slide, Andrew.
Yeah, just to kind of illustrate how detailed they can be. This is in Tilton. So we're looking at, you can see this house in the upper left-hand corner with the kind of the double balcony porch and all the gingerbread. And it's still intact, which is what we like to see. And as are the two houses on either side of it. So it's a fun detail. And then starting, I think in the 1930s, kind of as a Depression era project, we sent out a lot of foresters into the woods to map out blister rust that was affecting the pine trees. And so these maps, which are all archived at the state archives, can give you a good sense of, if you have a more rural property, what the fields and even cellar holes were like in the neighborhood in the 1930s. And they go up to, I think, even early 1950s. So it can just be a nice kind of contextual item to look at.
Another really useful source of information are town and county histories. In the late 19th, early 20th century, there was kind of this huge resurgence in interest in local history. And there were a huge amount of books published on specific towns or counties. And a lot of them are out of copyright, so have been scanned and, importantly, OCR'd so that they're available online and are searchable. So if you know the name of somebody associated with your property, sometimes you can type that in, or the name of a specific group they were associated with, and you can find a lot of information fairly quickly. Most of these books are also available at local libraries and local historical societies, and at the State Library and State Historical Society. For newer publications that are still in copyright, you usually need to go track them down at the local library or historical society or the State Library. And so we come to deeds. Deed research can be very frustrating and is definitely a bit of an art and takes a lot of practice. The different counties in New Hampshire have different amounts of information available and searchable online. Some counties, you can go almost back to the first European settlement in the state, and some counties, such as Grafton, you have to go to the actual county seat all the way over in Haverhill to do research. All of them you can go to and do research as well, but sometimes it's easier to be able to do online. For newer houses, the research is a lot easier. The records are all typed and well cross-referenced. Older deeds can be a little bit challenging because of the archaic language and the handwriting. But with some practice, you can get it.
I'd say it can also get really confusing if your property's been subdivided several times or
yeah.
maybe re-annexed several times, or if it's gone between members of the same family within the same year.
Yeah,
So I always find it's usually starting around like 1940 when they stopped leaving kind of the breadcrumb trail, which is, you know, providing you the book and page number of the
Yeah.
previous owner. It's best to go to the office itself so that you can go through the grantee grantor index. And sometimes you have to work forwards rather than backwards
yeah.
for portions of your.
Some of the counties do have searchable grantee grantor indexes online. So it's a little easier, but yeah, I'd agree with Andrew. And also, sometimes it can get really confusing when the property goes through probate and that's how it transfers when somebody dies. So it can be hard
Yeah.
for sure.
This is kind of an obvious one, but if you can find a stash of historic photos, either at your local library or historical society, sometimes the New Hampshire Historical Society, they're obviously terrific snapshots in time of your property. And you might have to use different keywords depending on where your house is located. So it can be a needle in a haystack. And if you have just a vernacular house, it's, you know, if it's not really spectacular and maybe the family didn't pay for a photograph to be taken, you might not have any luck.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about historic photos is they don't lie. So they're pretty much as accurate as you can get if you can figure out the date for it.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of fleshing out the social history part of your house. So once you have this notepad, hopefully full of deed and maps and maybe an architectural analysis, kind of giving you a rough idea of when your house was built, it can be really interesting. And probably most people's favorite part is finding out who lived there and maybe how they afforded some of the changes or when they made some of the changes to your house, assuming that it's not a perfect, you know, 1872 Italianate house. There's probably been a lot of changes made to it over the decades. So the best, if you want to, yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
So the census is a really good place to dig. I find that the best census records are between 1850 and the early 1900s, because that gives you more information about the occupation of your inhabitants. Pre, 1840 and before, it's really less information. It's just listing who lives in the house and if they can read or write and what race they are. And maybe if they have a certain educational attainment.
Yeah, it depends.
And if you have access to ancestry.com, that's great. Maybe your local library or the state library is a place for you to go. If you don't have that account, you can also go on familysearch.com, which is a service provided by the Church of Latter-day Saints.
I think it's a .org.
.org.
I think so.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have that in a later slide. And that's free, which is nice.
It is free. And so what a thing about census is sometimes, if you have a maybe a strange name or something that doesn't transcribe very well in their algorithms, like a Hezekiah someone, and you just can't find him, he's not popping up in the search, you can download your town's entire census tract sheets. And if you can find neighbors that have an easier name, like a William Jones, you can usually find your person before or above that name. So it might take some searching. Don't just trust the search feature.
Yeah, well, and also the people that were compiling the census did misspell things every once in a
Yes.
while. So that also.
Yeah,
kind of
and same with deeds too, with the handwritten deeds. You might
Yeah.
have one person spelled 3 different ways. I find it more actually with the women's names because maybe they just didn't they didn't care as much, to be honest. And then there's a really interesting census, which isn't digitized, but you can find it on the microfiche at the state library, and that's the agricultural and industrial census records. And those were made between 1850 and 1890. And those will go into great depth about what your farmer was growing on their property, the value of, the slaughtered animals, the acreage they were having in pasturage. So it can give you some really good insight as to how your property was being used. And I think another really interesting thing about the agricultural census is between 1850 and 1890, you can see these New England farmers diversifying their farms to kind of compete with the Midwest, as all their sons are pretty much moving westward. They're adding dairy cows, they're adding orchards, they're adding butter production, they're adding honey. So it's really fascinating glimpse at New Hampshire history through these census records. And the industrial census will also show if your homeowner was maybe a blacksmith or a miller of some kind, it'll give you the same kind of production outputs. I think this slide was just to show that there's a lot being digitized online, and sometimes it's worth going through Google Books and using various keywords and quotations to try to refine your search. So it'll pull up histories locally and afar. So if your homeowner was maybe part of that westward move, which is an example here, this was a neighboring house of mine. I just did a Google search. It turns out that his family had moved to Iowa, and so his kids had placed their roots there, and they became headmasters of local schools. And I think one of this is on Find a Grave, which is a great resource. It included a copy of the obituary of maybe his son. So it kind of gave some background to confirm that, yes, he had grown up in New Hampshire. He was an axe maker and he headed west. Same kind of thing. Sometimes if you're doing digital searches, or even not, if maybe your local library has a scrapbook collection, you can find articles in papers or magazines. Papers is definitely kind of a needle in a haystack thing. I'd leave that for kind of your last search, because you can spend hours and maybe only find that your person had tea with their sister every other Thursday, which is interesting but doesn't help all that much. But really starting in the late 1890s, New Hampshire started advertising a lot of these abandoned farmsteads as these summer home opportunities. And so you might have a really good stroke of luck and find that your house was profiled in one of those magazines. And I have those, they're also at the state library, but I have a fair amount digitized into PDF copies, and we could send those around. Because if anything, it's just really, it's interesting to look at the New Hampshire Board of Agriculture profiling these New Jersey and Boston families who have come to these rural towns and saved them through casual potato growing and cookouts with their friends. Also digitized. So if your house, late 1800s, 1900s on, there was a chance that it probably came from a kit or some sort of catalog option. So this is an example in Lime Center, the yellow house, and you can see that it's a pretty close match. And I can't remember the publication. But chances are pretty high that these houses were not being, architecturally designed for bespoke purposes. They were kind of mass produced. So I'm going to talk quickly about the physical evidence of the landscape of your property. And it's just good to know kind of a background of your town's history and how it evolved. Was it influenced by turnpikes? Was it influenced by railroads? Was it influenced by 1950s on, maybe interstate travel? Because anything technically before 1971 is potentially historic now, using that 50-year cutoff from the National Park Service. So your split level ranch on a cul-de-sac in Salem could be historic. So we won't go to, actually, I think this is the only slide we do on architectural styles
Yeah.
because it's a totally different topic. Well, it's an important topic, but we've done presentations on just architectural style alone. But it can be a really good way of just roughly ballparking the date of your house's construction, kind of knowing the trend of New Hampshire architecture from Georgian and Federal in the 18th century and sometimes early 19th century, up to and through Italianate, Queen Anne, bungalow, and
Modern.
Dutch colonial. So
Sorry, I'm like rushing a little bit because I
yeah,
want to
May's
make sure we have time
the
for.
timekeeper here. And then once you have a bigger picture, you can go down into the details to either confirm or to kind of hone in on the date of your house's construction. So you can look at window profiles. So hopefully you still have your original windows or you still have wood windows. If not, we can talk about that over beers later. But we have Jim Garvin's done a terrific job kind of cataloging Muntin profiles and mantelpieces and doorways. So these are all pieces of evidence that can help you refine the date of your home's construction.
Or the date of changes.
Or the
Your
date of
house.
changes, exactly, yeah, because as you can see in this picture, it's a 2/2 window. Likely it was originally, a 9/6 or a 6/6 window. And starting, in the 1880s, probably, people started swapping out their smaller paned windows for larger paned windows. May, do you want to talk about your favorite?
Sure. I mean, again, it's the same kind of, over time, our technology for how we're building houses has changed. So there's definite evolutions in things like nails and screws and how we split stones, how we have sawn wood, whether you're using an adze or a vertical water powered saw or a circular saw. These are all things that are little pieces of information that can help you come to a date. And I'll get into this a little bit when we get into some examples.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch touch on this quickly. Even as architectural historians, we're always kind of learning and being surprised by things. So this is, you look at it and you think, okay, it's a Greek Revival house, maybe 1850s. This unfortunately is a house that May and I went through before it got demolished, and I took the windows and May took the ice crusher. But you'd think at a kind of a typical Greek Revival house, you would have this kind of stone colored original color scheme for it, because Greek Revival was about kind of mimicking that, what we thought was the Parthenon. But when we started taking away some of the architectural materials, like the trim, we found that the color scheme was actually really surprising, in that the original clapboards were this kind of bright Easter yellow, and the trim was this bright Easter green. So it kind of totally changed how I thought about the era. And I mean, if this was done in rural Grafton, then it couldn't have just been a one. I mean, they saw it somewhere probably. But we know then by the late 19th century, the color change had happened already, which is how we get this idea that all buildings are white, because by the time brilliant white paint was created in the 1915, 1920 era, we painted everything bright white. So we had this kind of false idea that everything in New England was white.
All right. With that said, we're going to have to fairly quickly go through a couple examples. So I thought as a first example, I would show a project of mine. This is a late 18th century farmhouse, building type that a lot of you are very familiar with because it's all over New Hampshire. This farmhouse is owned by the Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire, and I was hired as part of a team to go through and figure out the history and evolution of the building in order to create a rehabilitation plan for the building, which includes splitting the building into 2 apartments, one for a tenant farmer and one as an income generating space as a rental for Southeast Land Trust. So the first thing I did as I was looking at this was start pulling maps. So I pulled a bunch of historic maps of Epping. In the upper left here, you have the 1784 map of Epping, which is a little hard to tell specifically which buildings are where, but does show that the upper or the northeast corner of the town was fairly established by that date. By 1860, the house is very clearly shown on the map as being occupied by a J.P. Chase. And the road through the property that's now a definite little farm lane was a through road that connected to another part of town, which I thought was interesting. By 1892, on the right here, it was associated with H. Underhill. I then went and did some of the deed research back and found a bunch of other names associated with the property, such as Moses Davis, Stephen Dow, John Prescott Chase, William Harvey Underhill, and others. I was then able to go online and go through familysearch.org to figure out if to search for those names in Epping on cemetery records, census records, birth, marriage, and death records, and try to fill out a little of that social history of who those people were and what they were doing. I found out that in 1785, Moses Davis purchased what was then a 135-acre farm from Edward Sanborn for £947. And at that time, there was a dwelling house on the property. By the time of the first US federal census in 1790, Moses Davis was living in Epping. In 1807, when Davis died, he left his estate to his wife, Anna Folsom Davis. And at that time, it was 150 acres. When Anna died in 1826, the property was split among all of their children. So the 150 acres went a bunch of different ways. Within the next few years, by the 1830s, a local man named Stephen Dow began to buy back all of those different parcels and reunite the farm. And then he sold it to John Prescott Chase in 1839. John Prescott Chase got married in 1842, and by 1850 was shown on the census in the lower left as living on the farm with his wife and his daughter. Unfortunately for me in this project, we were only able to find one historic photograph of the farm, and that's what we have here, which is a little blown out, unfortunately, but it gives us an idea of what the building looked like around the turn of the 20th century. So with all this data in mind, I went out and actually began to explore the building. I spent probably a good day crawling around, looking at different details, you know, how were different kinds of timbers manufactured, what's the general layout of the building, what kind of nails am I finding, that kind of thing. The general form of the house is a really common floor plan in New Hampshire from between about 1725 and 1825, which is a two-story, two-room deep building with a center chimney and two fairly formal rooms on the first floor in the front, and then a big long room in the back that held the kitchen and the kitchen hearth. And sometimes there were small rooms on either end of that kitchen room. The second floor typically had finished bed chambers at the front that were heated on either side of the stair hall, and the back long room was usually left unfinished and was used for storage or extra space. When I went up into the attic of the building, I found a fully exposed timber frame and saw that the principal rafters of the frame are all hewn with a broad axe, and the roof is a rafter and purlin roof with 6 sets of rafters, 6 vents and 5 bays, and 3 hewn purlins at each slope. And this is typical of houses of Eastern New Hampshire in the 18th century. The diagonal struts I don't know if you can see this, between the purlin, the center purlin and the floor are all sawn on a reciprocating water-powered saw, as are all the roof sheathing boards, which gives us another indication that this is very typical of a late 18th century building. Later buildings would be circular sawn. After about 1820, 1830 in New Hampshire, a lot of sawmills changed over to circular. We then worked our way down through the building and found a lot of really intact early features in the building. This one little room in the L has a lot of early Georgian features, such as the original Georgian paneling, original hardware, and original plaster. You can kind of see in the picture, depending on your screen resolution, that all these boards are hand planed, so they're a little bit wavy. And the door handle is an early Suffolk latch. You can't see, but it has early hinges that it sits on. And the plaster walls and ceiling are on an early style of lath. Other really intact rooms were some of those more formal rooms at the front of the house. And the lower left, we have what's probably the best sitting room on the southwest chamber, with very intact Georgian paneling, with the exception of this, which is 20th century, and an early Georgian door with a Norfolk style latch. In the bedroom upstairs, we can see some of the changes starting to take place with one of the early renovations of the building. You have Georgian paneling here. This is actually added in the 1990s. And then you have some Greek revival style details over here that are more early 19th century, with the 4-panel Greek revival doors and the porcelain knobs. One of the most interesting parts of the house is the front entry stair hall. Typically in a house of this period, the stair hall would look like here in the upper right, where you would walk in, go up maybe a stair or two to a landing or a turn, and then across the back to another landing or turn, and then up to the next floor. But the JPC farmhouse has this beautiful curved staircase, which was, the room was really awkward, so it wasn't the best photograph, but, and this whole area has more 19th century plaster, more 19th century typical balusters on the stair, and a more 19th century newel post, more typical of about 1845. So wanting to figure out if it really had this early turn stair or not, we went up into the attic and very, very carefully pulled up a floorboard. And the floorboard was affixed with a manufactured nail that wasn't introduced in New Hampshire until about 1805 in Portsmouth, according to Jim Garvin. So I said, aha, these aren't the original floorboards in the attic. And then we were able to look down in the shaft behind the stairwell, between the stairwell, the curved wall of the stair, and the chimney, and see here at the left is part of the stair, but the intact Georgian paneling with original paint, and the line across where there was once a landing. And interestingly, we didn't notice it until I got back and put the picture up on my computer. There is some kind of 200-year-old note on the wall. And hopefully this summer we'll figure out what it says. I wasn't able to read it no matter what I did with contrast filters. But the project has been funded, and this summer they are going to very carefully pull up those attic floorboards to add insulation, and we should be able to tell what it said.
So I'm going to give an example of kind of a more vernacular 19th century rural house, and this one happens to be in Hanover. And I was reached out to by the new owner, who had been told it was built in 1790, and he just wanted confirmation on that. So right from the get-go, if you kind of look at it, does that look like a 1790 house?
I wouldn't say so.
Yeah, I was kind of thrown off by the deep eaves.
Yeah.
And if you look,
And
well,
the
you can't
window
really,
light.
I don't know if next slide maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you look,
Oh.
you know, the front entranceway has this kind of very Greek revival entablature. And the nails were not 18th century. You know, they're still old, but they're kind of more early mid 19th century. So just based on the architecture and kind of the physical material of the building, I started thinking this is really not 1790 house. We all want our house to be older than it actually is in New Hampshire or New England. It doesn't mean it's not special. It just means it's not as old as we think it is. Go to the next slide. So again, kind of backing that up, you know, all the Muntin profiles in the windows, the plaster details, the fact that there was no evidence of a large central chimney stack, all pointed again to this was really not a 1790 house. It's actually a plank house, which is interesting. We could probably talk more about that at another time. But it's a plank house is not framed like a normal house. You kind of have the main carrying posts and beams, but then the structural integrity is gained through these hefty planks that are applied to the exterior shell, which makes wiring or plumbing or anything in your house very difficult. If any of you guys have a plank house, you know what I'm talking about. So you can also see in the milling of the wood that it was done by an up and down sawmill. So, you know, not circular sawn. So we know it's probably pre-Civil War, but also not, you know, no hand-hewn beams or joists. So, you know, we're looking at, this is a house that was built in the decades after industrialization. You know, localized industrialization had happened on the waterways, even in rural Western New Hampshire. I know that Hanover is not rural, but this isn't a part of Hanover that is rural. So anyway, if you look at the maps, we go back again to the 1816, 1892 maps. It gives us some names that we can kind of cross-reference with our deed research. And in this case, there's an H or a Hiram Pressey in 1860, and then 1892 map, it shows that it's actually owned by Dartmouth Savings Bank, which comes to a bigger story later on. So going back through the census records, we find that really in the 18th century, through the deeds and the census, it kind of bebops around between members of the same family. And if you also look at kind of the bigger picture of the census, you know that it's passing between even like relatives and neighbors who have intermarried with children. So if you did a genealogical study on a lot of this, you'd see that there were a lot of second cousins and sisters-in-laws and sons-in-law that were all involved in this house as they tried to make a go of it. And you can see in the occupation list that they're not all farmers, even if the deed says that they're, you know, yeomen or farmers. Thomas Pressey, one of the owners, was actually a master tin plate worker. And you can also see in the house, he was boarding other tin plate workers and apprentices and domestics too. So he had kind of given up on the farming and decided to go with something a little more maybe stable. And this is just kind of a quick idea of what my notes, or probably May's notes, are even better than mine. But this, you can get an idea. The highlighted sections suggest times of transition for the house. So in 1829 was when the property was kind of subdivided from the original proprietors' lots and made into more manageable, saleable lots with the road frontage. And then it was sold in 1839 for 3 times, or even more than 3 times the worth of when it was purchased in 1829. So it kind of gives you an idea that it was probably built in the 1830s because the lot size is getting smaller. So there's something on that land that made it appreciate in value quite a bit. And then in the 1860s, there were some interior changes. And usually when a house leaves a family line is when changes are made. So I'll kind of leave it at that, but not a 1790 house based on architectural and social history. All right, May, finish us off.
Yeah, so according to my computer, I only have 2 minutes to get through the last 2 examples. So I'm gonna just try to give you the best details on them. So,
Take your time.
all right. Well, I wanted to
Hour,
give
May.
the example of how research differs for different kinds of buildings. So I wanted to give an example of an urban outbuilding, something that might be a little bit more difficult to research because, again, like some of those really rural buildings, people don't tend to photograph their barns or their sheds. Sometimes it'll be in the background of another building, or the background of a picture of, you know, somebody's pet, or something like that. And then also, you know, usually deeds don't tend to list these kinds of things. They aren't shown on the maps, so they can be a little bit more difficult to research. This example is in Littleton, and belongs to the Littleton Community Center. This barn, fortunately, it was a carriage barn, and they did have the original architectural drawings of the building, not necessarily as it was built, but as the architect intended it to be built. So that gave us a good idea of what it looked like then and what it looked like now. I'm gonna just skip that slide. So here's some examples of, okay, we don't have a lot of pictures of the carriage house. Oh, actually, we do. So the house was grand enough that it was photographed and included in the James A. Wood New Hampshire Homes book, which was published in 1895. So it shows what the carriage barn in the background looked like fairly shortly after it was constructed. In the lower right, we have a postcard of the community house in about 1910. And you can just barely see the carriage barn in the lower right of the foreground. Unfortunately, we can't do what they do in all the BBC mystery shows that I watch, where we can't like zoom in and go around the corner and enhance, because that isn't possible. But you get a little bit of an idea of what the building looked like. And then in the lower left, we have a picture of some children that had performed a play for the community center, probably in the 1920s, it was my guess. And they are in front of the carriage barn under this awning that I was having a little bit of trouble dating. And at the left, you can see the original ice house for the property that was torn down. So here, fortunately, Littleton is a really bustling community, and had a lot of mills, so they had Sanborn fire insurance maps. So I was able to kind of narrow down the date for that awning between 1887, where it wasn't visible, and 1921, where all of a sudden it's there. And these also show that ice house that is no longer there. And then my last example really quickly is the newer old house. New old houses are kind of difficult to research in a sense because they're not usually included in histories. I think it takes a couple of generations for us to realize the importance of history, and that things are historic. So this is my own house in Center Harbor, which was built in about 1940, or it was built in 1940. And I've been fortunate enough to get in contact with the daughter of the man who built the house. So she was able to supply this photograph of my house right after they moved in. They weren't included on the 1940 census, however, because they hadn't moved in yet, but the house was there, as can be seen by the map from the 1940 census. With newer old houses, it's really important to just try to, as much as you can, reach out to former owners and get information from them. I was really, really lucky. I one day was out on this sun porch eating lunch that was obviously added after the house was constructed. And somebody pulled up in front of my house, and this guy got out of his car and explained loudly to his friend, "Oh, I used to live in, this was my grandparents' house, and I used to summer here." And of course, I threw my sandwich down and ran outside and said, wait, I need to know the history. Tell me about it. So it's kind of about timing and figuring out, just keeping your ear to the ground and asking older neighbors. I had a neighbor down the street that all he could remember in his 80s was that, oh, they used to have dogs and the dog would chase me as I was walking to school. But you kind of grab on to those little bits of information. Also, directories we haven't really talked about. Those are really helpful. Through that, I was able to find out that my property originally had 2 tourist cabins, which were actually down behind the house and have now been moved. And I was able to find out that they were rented out in the 1940s under the name Grampian House as a cabin colony to tourists. The other thing is with the physical evidence in a new old house, you have more manufactured information or manufactured products. So my house has homosote walls and it had wall-to-wall linoleum. I moved a 1970s cabinet in the kitchen and found this kind of bright, I'll say bright, blue linoleum underneath it, and was able to then go onto archive.org and find an Armstrong pattern book from 1940 and find my linoleum, which I keep describing as Smurf blue. It looks a little less bright in this picture. Also, I was able to figure out the manufacturer of my siding when I was repairing some rot on my house, opened a cavity, and this label popped out. So you find little pieces and you kind of slowly piece together the story. And I think that's it for me.
Is that it for you, Andrew?
I assume we'll have a lot of, I hope we have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So we can
Well,
go
thank
into-
you both so much. There's so much great information here. I know we could go on and on and on, but we need to try to keep to our hour. We had one question in the chat. Please feel free to add some more, but I'll start with Digit's question, Andrew, addressed to you. Can you just explain what the grantee grantor index is when you were talking about the registry of deeds, I believe?
Yeah, so the all county deed offices, in addition to this, the deed books have these additional books called the grantee grantor index. And so that will list by surname alphabetically every grantee and grantor that's listed in the census records. And it'll tell you what the book and the page number that deed is recorded to. So if you knew that sometime in the 1840s that a William Johnson had sold your property or at one time owned your property, you can kind of look through that grantee grantor index. There might be several William Johnsons, but it can at least narrow it down to a few likely options. And it might take some digging. Then you might have 3 books and page combinations to go through, but you'll recognize the tract description in the deed and say, yep, this is the one.
Okay, thank you. Another one relating to census. Can you search census records for by street address?
Sometimes, like in Manchester, yes. Starting probably in 1880s, maybe they'll list streets and even addresses, especially in the 1900s, definitely by then.
Yeah, definitely by the night. It
In
depends on the
rural
community
areas-
too.
What's that?
It depends on the community too. Some
Yeah.
communities, more rural places are less likely to have the street listed. But then also with the rural communities, sometimes you only have 8 pages to skim through. So you might know somebody who's near that property and be able to figure it out that way.
They did take the census geographically, so you should, your neighborhood will be kind of together. You'll see your neighbors' names, which is why those maps are kind of helpful. And one quick note about the census is that the 1890 census is missing. It was burned in a fire. So that 1892 herd map kind of replaces what we don't know in the census.
Well, and Grafton County is missing a couple of the counties are missing chunks because of different fires and different things.
Yeah.
So they can be hard to track down.
And so the county histories might also be helpful at that time because they were published around the same time. So they'll list like people who lived in town, mostly like white doctors and lawyers and prosperous farmers, but you can cross your fingers and hope that they're described.
Okay, next question. Would New Hampshire have early maps, as in 1700s, of bordering Massachusetts towns? Like Nashua was part of her town of Dunstable, Mass.
Mhm.
So do we go over the state line?
Some towns definitely had maps made. You know, they either had they paid surveyors or proprietors to do more detailed surveys. So yeah, I would think that that's something that the National Library, or even maybe even the Boston Public Library has in their digital collection. You know, even towns like Canaan had special maps made in the 1850s. So I would be surprised if larger places on the southern border did not have maps like May's Epping map.
Yeah, I was gonna say too, some of those maps are held by the New Hampshire State Library and aren't available online, but if you go in, they do have them. So it's just, it depends on your timing and you know how much you want to get into it for searching, but they're out there.
Okay, great. No other questions in chat, but I have a question, and please feel free to add to the chat. My question is, I did some preliminary research and I got back to a period in, I don't know when it was, 1870s, where the deeds started or no longer talked about the house. It was only the land. So, but I know that the house was there. So when you get stuck like that, what's a good thing to do next, or what's a good resource to go to?
So deeds seldom actually talk about the improvements on the property, which is frustrating. Sometimes they'll say, you know, and barn lot included or something, but so I either look for, again, kind of the change in values to see if there's been some drastic increase in the property value, or just kind of say, well, the deed's only going to get me so far, and go to something like maps or physical
evidence,
architectural evidence. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so no more questions in chat. What I'd like to do now is just do my wrap up. And for those who want to stay on, I think we'll unmute and just have an open discussion once I do the wrap up here. So I just wanted to thank Andrew and May again for this great presentation. There's so much helpful tips and information on how to get started, or to even dig deeper if you've already started your house history research. I know there was a lot mentioned here, and I just want to remind everybody that I will be sending out an email with a lot of the information in it, with links and things like that, and also the handout that May had referred to. Thoughtful and experienced presenters like Andrew and May, and your great questions and involvement make a huge impact on advancing preservation interest and efforts across New Hampshire. We want you to know the Alliance is here to help, and encourage you to check out our website at nhpreservation.org, or send us an email to bt@nhpreservation at any time. Our next Expo session will be Tuesday, August 3rd at noontime with Tracy Kozak. Tracy's the principal architect at JSA Design. She'll be presenting Working with an Architect, Preserving and Enhancing Your Historic Property. For details on this and the complete Expo schedule, visit nhpreservation.org. We encourage you to share our Expo link with other old house and barn enthusiasts, and be sure to check out our Expo guide of 50 products and service providers on the Expo page of the website. And for those of you who have been to our in-person Expo in the past, you know we love to give away door prizes at our event as a token of our appreciation. So today's lucky winner that I picked randomly is Gwen Bruno, and Gwen will receive A Building History of Northern New England, which is a book by James Garvin that was referred to multiple times in today's presentation. Gwen, are you still with us? You can unmute yourself and say hello if you'd like. I know she was here earlier. Anyway, she may have logged off. We'll be sending that book to Gwen. So please watch for my follow-up email. I'm hoping to get it out tomorrow with additional links, resource information, and May's handout, and a short survey that I ask you to fill out to help us plan for future programs. Thanks again to Andrew and May for their wonderful presentation, to our Old House and Barn Expo on the Road sponsors listed here on the screen, and to all of you who are supporters of our critical work that helps to advance, to save and steward special places around New Hampshire. And please keep the Preservation Alliance vibrant by making a donation or considering a gift of membership. We wish you well and look forward to seeing you at future Alliance programs. Thanks for joining us today. Take care, everyone. And for those who want to stay on, please feel free to do so for a few more minutes. And May, you can stop sharing.
All right.
Okay. And if any, I think at this point, since our numbers have been reduced a bit, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment or however you want to participate.
After party mode.
Yeah. I'm just going through the chat now. Lots of great thank yous to May and Andrew. Anything else, Andrew and May, you want to add, since we got a little bit rushed at the end there?
Boy, there's so much.
Well, I'll ask a question.
Yep.
I'll ask you a question in general, and this is very general. Can you expect to have to spend a half a year on really getting all this good information, or how long does it take? If you're lucky, let's say if you're lucky.
That's really hard to answer.
I know it is.
I mean, we do this for a living, so we're probably a little quicker. And it also depends on how detailed you want to be. You know, what's your end goal for your research? Do you want to just get a general idea of the history of your house, or do you want to know like every little bit of information about everybody that lived in that house and when every nail went into the wall?
Yeah, I mean, I found when I was doing that Hanover house, just going through all the deeds and tying it up with the census and going through genealogy to figure out when those people lived and how their kids were related to maybe future owners. And yeah, I mean, you can go down rabbit holes, right? And maybe only 30% of your rabbit holes are going to be fruitful. So yeah. I'd say it can take definitely months. Yeah.
Well, and you have to be, you know, I find myself going down rabbit holes doing this. You know, all of a sudden I'll say, oh, I wonder who this domestic servant was that was living in this house at one point. And then I'll start researching them and then realize, oh, wait, that's not something I need to be doing right now, as interesting as it is, and, you know, get back to the building. So what's fun about it, to me at least, is every building is a completely different set of circumstances and a completely different story. So you're in this field, I feel like you're constantly learning stuff and learning about different building types, different arrangements. You know, you can kind of never stop.
So in all the, when you're researching at the libraries through either a website or actually going in, that there's no charge for any of that, correct?
Correct, unless you
public library, yeah.
Copies, yeah.
Right.
And most of the things that I've listed today and talked about today are things that you can do for free. Because I realize, you know, ancestry.com is kind of pricey. You know, and some of these types of websites, it adds up. So,
but as Andrew pointed out, quite often libraries have subscriptions, right?
Right, that's true.
Right.
And Family Search, you said, was free.
It is free.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's good. Great. Anything else, anybody? No? Tom, hi. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, Tom can do the whole.
You want to add anything, Tom?
Good to see you all again. Good to see you, May. I love the Center Harbor history stuff. You've given me some notes here, a few more leads.
Nice.
Great. And thanks for the call out on my book and stuff. This is great. I mean, it's what we do. It's what we've been doing for so long. I guess the only thing that comes to mind just as a suggestion for those working in cities, I often start with the city directories, but once again, one may need to go to the library to really try to figure it out. In the rural places, that's not such a fruitful source, but those city directories, when you have them, can be really, really helpful. But no, a very impressive presentation. I really liked your approach to look at the physical and then build it into the archival, but be careful of the deeds. The grantor, the grantee indexes, that can be, yes, like you say, Andrew, what a rabbit hole of days, of weeks, and for the effort, it's hard to, you don't always know what you're going to get. So good work.
All right. Thank you, Tom. All right. So let's just wrap it up. Thanks again to May and Andrew and everybody for joining, and hope to see you at future programs. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.